So Fujifilm has finally released their GFX100RF camera. I was very much lucky enough to get a copy of the camera just before I went down to Okinawa the other day for shooting with Red Bull. And I had a great time shooting with the camera over 2 days. Went and did a bunch of street shooting during the day and the night. Plus I took it to my job site and shot a little bit at the Red Bull BC1 event we were doing down there. Now, there's a lot of good and negative points being flown around the internet about the GFX100RF. So I thought I'd go through these points, both positive and negative, and just give my opinion about these different points, just, from the viewpoint of my own personal experience as a photographer and as someone who was using the camera for the first time. Yeah, so let's just jump into it. So first off, if you've ever used the GFX system, you would know that the GFX cameras have about a 102 megapixel sensor. There's nothing different here with the GFX100RF. Massive sensor, huge images that come out of this camera. And I'm happy to say that the images I got out of the camera over the weekend were great. The images are really, really huge. So if you are doing any kind of close-up editing or anything like that, you have lots of room to work with. I actually remember this image. I wanted to erase a few people that were in the background just because it was a little cluttered. And I was zoomed in quite a bit while I was doing this editing in Photoshop. And it took a little longer than I expected. But while you're doing it, you kind of get used to looking at the resolution of the image. And then when I zoomed out, I was reminded about just how wide the image was and how much real estate I had to work with. If I was zoomed in on an image from my Nikon Z9 at this size and this resolution, I'd probably be about 50% or so. But I think when I was editing this image, I was actually about 200 or 300% or more. So it was quite a huge image that you get to deal with, and they're really easy to edit, and the colors were great, and the images just come out really, really nice. Now, for a 102 megapixel camera, you think this thing would be much, much bigger, but it's actually quite light and small. When I was shooting the Red Bull event, I was using my Nikon Z9 along with this. So I had this kind of strapped across my body and down by my hip for about half of the day or so. And normally I hate having a second camera on my body. I almost never do it. I actually bought the Nikon ZF for that, but I never actually do it. I just hate the extra weight and that on my body while I'm shooting. But this is great. I barely even noticed it was there. Able to grab it, pick it up, take a few shots, take some video in that while I was working. And it was no inconvenience at all. The build quality of the camera itself seems to be amazing. It has none of this plastic on here that could come off like my Z9 has had in the past. Great job on Fuji for making the camera so small, yet so powerful and robust. And I'm not too afraid, I'm not going to drop it, but I'm not too afraid that if I did accidentally drop it, that it would smash into a million pieces. Seems really, really well built. Now, one of the main selling points of this camera actually seems to be this ratio dial that you find here on the back, in the middle, up at the top. Now, this is an interesting concept that Fujifilm, I think, is the first to bring to an actual physical dial on a camera. You can change the dial to various different ratios, and you can see a little white box in the viewfinder to let you know exactly how big that ratio is when you're taking a picture. In theory, this is something that's kind of interesting. I'm not really sure I would use it myself. I mean, you could just have digital overlays of the ratios and shoot raw, so you basically know how to frame, and that would work as well. But it is interesting. I find it interesting that Fujifilm is doing something new, but I never really use it at all except for when I was testing it to see what it would do. Normally I shoot raw, so I want the full frame of the image that I can possibly get. So I'm not really going to play with ratios and stuff like that until afterwards. Now, one place I could see using this kind of dial professionally is if I'm working with somebody who needs images right away out of the camera for, say, social media and that. Now, in this instance, I would shoot raw JPEG, and I would set the dial to whatever they are requesting. And that way, at the end of the day, I have the JPEGs already cropped in the way they want it to, and leave it to them right away. Plus, when I'm shooting, I can be extra careful of my composition so that I know, say I have the horizontal, but they want a vertical for stories or reels or anything like that, then I know I can get the horizontal image and the vertical one just how I want it as well in the end. So it could be a good way to use it that way. Now, one thing when I first started using this camera was I had it set to only RAW, and I couldn't actually use the dial on it at all. The ratio dial just wouldn't work, it wouldn't do anything. So looking online, it seemed that I had to have it at least at RAW and JPEG. Once I changed it to that, I could change it up and use it, and it worked fine. Another point I found kind of confusing with this though is after shooting, I then open up the images into Bridge, and looking at Bridge, it looked like the RAWs were actually fully cropped. You would look at the image, it says RAW on there, and it looks like in the thumbnail, they've actually gone and cropped the RAW. So at first, in the first time I actually made this video, I was rather confused. I thought this was a major mistake that Fujifilm had done. But thankfully, the first person that saw the video, basically, they commented and said, hey, try opening it up in your program and see what it looks like. So what has actually happened is the camera has put the crop tool onto the RAW. You can just go to the crop tool, unlock the crop, and you get the full image. So it's a little counterintuitive, and it doesn't really, it adds in a little extra step, but in the end, you still have the full RAW and you get the full cropped JPEG as well. So yeah, hope that helps. If you had the same problem I did, I was so confused for a few days. I didn't even upload the video, but it was fine in the end. And now I understand what's going on. Another really cool aspect about this camera, it has a 4-stop ND filter built into the camera. Now I'm working on video more and more, and I like to shoot wide open, so I do have a few ND filters, but I noticed that the quality of the ND filters really change depending on the company. So I've bought some that I don't like, I have some that I do like, but again, it's always something extra you have to take with you. You can't forget, you gotta put it on the camera properly and things like that. It's always something easy to forget. But with the GFX100RF, this is built in. So the great thing about it built in is you can't forget it. And 4 stops is actually quite large. You can see here in the video that I'm showing, it makes a huge difference. So even out in bright daylight, although the camera is f4, you still will get great use out of the ND filter when out shooting in bright daylight when you're shooting video. Now, one point I had with the 4-stop ND filter when I was shooting is I would shoot video, and then I would have the ND filter on, and I would switch back to stills, and I would assume that the ND filter would be turned off because I only had it on for video, but it seems, at least in the version I have, that the ND filter will stay on. So if you're shooting between video and stills quite rapidly, and you don't want to have the ND filter on while you're shooting stills, you're going to have to shut it off, switch back, and then you shoot stills, and then you come back to video, turn it back on. It's an extra step, and it's kind of annoying. And I think if there is a way internally that I can tell the camera that, hey, when I switch to stills, if I don't have the ND filter on in the first place, please turn it off, that'd be great. Maybe there is somewhere in there. I just haven't dug quite that deep. So if you do know that, please let me know in the comments. That would be great. But all in all, having the internal ND filter was awesome, and it really helped me get some video out in the sun down in Okinawa. And another really big, great point about the GFX100RF is the autofocus system. And it's fast, it's reliable, and I was able to use it with all my shooting. Face detection was really good for the most part. I did find when I was shooting the B-boys that if I had face detection on, it would kind of get confused, but there's a lot of people in the background. This happens with my Z9 and my ZF. The cameras aren't perfect. They don't know exactly who you want to focus on. But when I was shooting portraits of the B-boys, it was locked on in their eye, no problem at all. No back focus, no nothing. And even when they went down to do some freezes and things like that, the autofocus followed them down, and it was great. I didn't miss any focus at all. So in the end, the GFX100RF also enjoys the great autofocus that Fujifilm has brought to its other modern cameras, and I don't think you're going to have any issues with autofocus at all with this camera. Now, so to touch on a few of the more contentious issues with this camera, so this is a 35mm lens f4 on a medium format body. So I come from the Nikon ZF and the Nikon Z9, and I have a really nice 35mm 1.4 that I love using. So in my head, when I picked up the camera, I was thinking 35, this is 35mm is about this, but in actuality, this is medium format. So your 35mm lens is actually more of a 28mm. That range is quite different, and you'll find that when shooting with this camera, you'll be shooting much wider than you expect. And also, the f4 is where a lot of people are really griping. Of course, if you're spending this much on a camera, this much on the lens, and that's all dedicated into it, you would hope you would have some faster glass on there. Now, I'm assuming that they went with f4 to keep everything as compact as possible, but shooting at f4, you really don't get the same nice bokeh that you will get with other cameras that are similar, that have bigger apertures. So that is unfortunate. But saying that, when I was really close to these flowers, I got some nice bokeh in the back there. It looks really good. And when I was shooting portraits with these B-boys, I like the background bokeh as well. It's not displeasing at all. Yes, 35mm, that's a little bit wider than I'm used to myself personally, especially it's actually about 28. But the cool thing is, with the 102 megapixel sensor is even if it's a little bit wider than you want it to be, cropping in is no problem at all. You'll still have great looking images. And in reality, the f4 wasn't that bad to use. I actually like how the images came out. You do still get a fair nice amount of good bokeh with the images. In imaginary makeup land where I could do anything I wanted to, yes, this would be awesome if it was a 1.2, 1.4 lens. That would have been amazing. But in reality, the f4 works great, and I really didn't mind how it looks in the end at all. Now, another major griping point for a lot of people about this camera is the fact that it doesn't have any internal stabilization in the camera or in the lens at all. So I see people online complaining that they can't get a sharp image even at 250th of a second and things like that. And I honestly am not sure what they were doing when they were taking the photos. when I was out shooting, especially at night, I was pushing the camera down to 1/60th and 1/30th, and I was getting very nice, clean, sharp images, and I was not really having any problem at all. Of course, I was being quite conscious when I was shooting these images. I had my arms in nice and tight. I was pushing the trigger nice and slow, and I was being as careful as I could. I wasn't running around and shooting and spraying in the streets and things like that. Because I came from a long history of cameras that didn't have internal stabilization. You're lucky if your lenses on the Nikon family, at least, had internal stabilization. But in the end, using this camera without the internal stabilization, I was just a little extra careful, took my time, and I still got great images even at below 250. So I'm really not sure what a lot of these people out there are doing. Now, if you look at the images I did get, you will notice that the subjects, the buildings and that are quite far away. So I was thinking, well, maybe the distance from me to the subject is so far away that even if I have a little bit of movement, it's not going to really affect the image at all. So when I got back to my hotel room, I set up a pet bottle or a water bottle on my desk beside a lamp, and I tried to see as low as I could go. Now, 250, 160, 130 were all fine. Getting a little bit lower than that, and I was getting a little bit of camera shake, I'll be honest. So it's, it's not magical, even if it doesn't have internal stabilization. But I was able to get quite low and have really good results. So with all the hype and complaining about non-internal stabilization in the camera, I think if you're a little careful and a little conscious when you're shooting with it, it's really not going to be an issue at all. And connected to this, I actually shot quite a bit of video with the camera as well. And you would think that without internal stabilization, all the video would be crazy shaky and I wouldn't be able to use any of it. But on the contrary, everything I shot, and it was all handheld, looked great. Like, I'm not doing anything crazy, fast movements and all that kind of stuff with the camera, obviously, but holding it handheld, even at night, it looked fine. And I'll say, the other day I was out shooting video with my Nikon ZF, and I accidentally had taken off the stabilization from the video settings. And the video I got was shaky as all anything. And I really ended up not being able to use it in the edit that I had made. But even without the internal stabilization, the video I got with this was nice and smooth. It was really good. And I'm doing the exact same thing I would be doing with my ZF. So I don't know if there's something else the camera's doing internally to help make up for the lack of internal stabilization, but I was able to get some pretty nice video out of the camera even without it. And in my personal style of shooting, I think that's basically all the good and bad things that I came across while shooting. Like I said, I did find it a little bit confusing to use at first, especially the ratio dial and things like that. But I did have a lot of fun using the camera. I think the images I got out of it are superb. They're huge, they're massive. The lightweightness of it and the size of the camera make it really something I'd want to throw on my hip while I run outside and go do some errands and things like that, or while I go off to Tokyo. And even taking portraits with it and doing things like b-boy portraits and their moves and freezes, I would often use a wider lens for that anyways. So the 28mm on here was great for that. And it's something, again, that I would like to try to use in the future. I think things like environmental portraits, shooting in areas where you want to include a lot of the environment, shooting in some of the more narrow streets here in Tokyo and things like that, this would be a great, great camera. But otherwise, if I could have this in my arsenal of cameras, I would love to have it because it is a fun camera to use. And in the end, that's what's needed in photography. That's what I'd love to have in my photography as much as possible, is fun and enjoyment, and something that you can just pick up and take out and really have a fun day with and get some amazing images in the end. So I hope that helps. You might have a different of opinion than me on the GFX100RF. I would love to hear from you in the comments. And yeah, talk to you guys soon. Cheers.